The fire has burned low. You have sat with it long enough to know its rhythm, when it breathes and when it merely smoulders. What comes next is not a new story. It is the old story grown heavier. Draw close. This part requires your full attention. The road north from Millbrook took 4 days in good weather and 5 in poor. Gareth left on a Tuesday in early autumn, when the maples at the Shadow Vale's edge had begun their first cautious experiments with colour, and the air carried the particular clarity that came before the cold settled in properly. He told Aldrich Weilmark he was going north for fletching materials. He told no one else anything. The grey carried him at a steady walk. He did not push the pace. He was not, in any meaningful sense, in a hurry. What awaited him in Thornwall would wait. What awaited him there was, in fact, precisely as predictable as the road itself. And the road, at least, had the decency to change its character every few miles. He had made this ride 18 times in his career. He knew it the way you know work you have returned to often enough that the returning itself has become part of the work. Each landmark annotated in the private record of accumulated experience. Each shift in the road's terrain corresponding to a shift in the thinking that the terrain reliably produced. The first day, borderland proper, familiar. The settlements spaced close enough that their smoke was company even when their people weren't. Fields doing the last of their autumn business. The road well kept, the footing sound. He thought, on the first day, about Dan. The boy had taken the Greys' tracks north at dawn 2 mornings ago. The first unauthorized solo patrol of the Shadow Vale margin that Gareth had documented in the private notation he kept for his own reference rather than the compact's record. He had said nothing about it. He would say nothing about it. The patrol had been competent, as far as he could determine from the return tracks. No unnecessary exposure, no poor ground choice, a clean line through the field margin. The boy had, at some point in the past year, stopped making the mistakes that beginners made and started making the smaller, more interesting mistakes that came later. This was not the reason Gareth was riding north, but it was the reason he was not concerned about leaving. The second day brought him into the ridgebacks, the long corrugated spine of hill country that the borderland locals named with the frank practicality of people who didn't bother with the cartographer's more distinguished terminology. Limestone and gorse and the particular grey-green light of overcast hill country in early autumn. The road climbed and the grey climbed with it, philosophical about gradients in the way she had always been philosophical about everything. He was thinking about the founding document when he smelled them. Not smoke, not cookfire. The specific compound of unwashed bodies, rancid fat, and the particular mineral note of creatures that spent significant time in stone and earth. He had been smelling this combination, in various concentrations, for 30 years, and his body's response to it had long since become a reflex rather than a decision. The grey stopped, because she had been trained to stop at the tension that preceded his stopping, and he was already reading the road ahead before she had fully committed to stillness. 5 of them, possibly 6. Positioned in the limestone outcrop where the road curved around the shoulder of the hill. Standard ambush placement for a band that had done this before, or had been told by someone who had done it before. The verge on the left showed the pressed grass of recent lateral movement. Someone had come along the road's parallel margin within the past 2 hours. He dismounted without ceremony and tied the grey's reins to a roadside post. He unslung his bow. The pattern he had been documenting for 27 months was consistent across terrain types. Goblins moving north by northwest, pressure originating from the deeper shadow veil, behavior suggesting displacement rather than territorial expansion. These were not scouts choosing a new range. These were creatures that had been pushed out of a range they had occupied and were moving because moving was what you did when something larger was operating in your territory. He took the high ground before they had finished processing the sound of his dismount. The limestone gave him cover and elevation, and the particular advantage of a man who has been working this kind of terrain since before the ambushes were born. The first arrow, 40 yards through the gap in the limestone where the leading scout had made the mistake of pausing to assess the empty road. The second, the one who broke toward the road. The third, the one who went uphill, which was the correct response and would have worked against a less mobile opponent. 2 remained. A young one that bolted into the gorse and would not stop running until it had put 2 miles between itself and the limestone. And the veteran. The veteran was older than the others in the visible way that certain scarred creatures were older. Not just in years, but in the accumulated cost of having survived things that should have finished them. It went flat against the rock and waited, which was correct, and Gareth acknowledged this in the private ledger of his attention by not underestimating it. They regarded each other for a moment. Then the veteran showed its empty hands and moved, not in surrender. Goblins did not surrender in any formal sense, but in the specific posture of a creature that had reassessed the situation and found it to contain more ranger than originally budgeted for. It walked northeast into the hill country, without haste and without looking back. Northeast, back toward the warband's reorganized territory. Back in the direction that, combined with the modified territorial markings he had copied into his notebook from the bodies, confirmed everything the previous months of observation had been building toward. He searched them. He was not looking for valuables. He was looking for the markings, the carved bone, the notched leather, the specific pigment placement on the arm wrappings that told a trained reader which warband, which territory, which lineage. What he found matched, in its fundamentals, the boundary stone he had first documented 3 years ago in the Shadow Vale's deeper reaches. The modifications confirmed reorganization. They were larger now, or they were drawing from a larger coordination network. Neither option was good news for Millbrook. He recorded this in the wax tablet notebook. 11 words in compact shorthand. He set the notation next to the previous entries and looked at the pattern. Something in the deeper wood was displacing the warband toward the borderlands. Whatever it was had been doing this for over 2 years, with increasing consistency. The warband was not choosing to range north. It was being pressed north. He remounted. He rode on. The road descended toward the gentler country on the far side of the ridgebacks, and beyond that was Aldervane Market Town, and beyond that was the river valley and Thornwall on its hill. The third day put him in Aldervane by afternoon. He passed through without stopping. A market town had its uses on the return journey, when he might need supplies. But on the northbound leg it was a delay. He ate from his pack on the road and kept moving. He thought, on the third day, about the founding document. He had read it twice in his career. The first time at his commission investiture, standing in the archive chamber with his hands behind his back, while a scholar read the relevant passages aloud in the careful, practiced manner of someone who read these passages often and had long since separated the reading from any engagement with the meaning. The second time, 7 years into his commission, when he had asked to read it himself. The scholar had been surprised. Rangers did not typically ask. The document was foundational in the way that foundations were foundational, present in everything built above them, rarely examined directly. What he had found, reading it himself, was that the founding document did not read like the work of idealists. It read like the work of pragmatists who had watched idealism fail and were attempting, with considerable care, to build something that would fail less badly. Shared intelligence, shared supply lines, shared oath structure. No shared command unless the territory demands it. The last clause had been the source of every significant internal conflict in the Compact's history, and the source of every significant external success. You could not capture the institution the way you captured a command structure, because there was no single point whose capture completed the transaction. But you also could not move the institution the way you moved a military force, because every part of it was independent enough to question the movement, and some of them would. 3 signatories had built this. Howell Cray, whose civic authority had never been a lord's authority, the People's Arrow. The compact was with the communities it served. Serenthrol Wynn, whose cross-cultural founding coalition had deliberately built an institution that served the borderlands as they actually existed, rather than as any one people defined them. Ruthen Danmore, whose record-keeping function had made the institution's authority legal rather than merely practical. The seal was the compact's, not any god's, and it was older than most of the noble house boundaries that now pressed against it. Aldous Cray presided over the current council. The weight of Howell Cray's name was in that chamber every time Aldous sat down, whether Aldous acknowledged it or not. Gareth had watched Aldous for 3 sessions now. He was a careful man. He was a man who understood his family's role in the institution's founding, and found that understanding uncomfortable in the specific way that inherited obligations were uncomfortable. You could not unknow what your name meant. He would not vote against Gareth. Gareth was reasonably certain of this. He was also reasonably certain that Aldous would not vote for him, and that this distinction between opposing and failing to support would be the most consequential thing that happened in the council chamber. The 4th day, the river valley. The road straightened as the Thornwall Hill came into view. Gareth had never been able to decide whether the approach impressed him or merely made him tired in a particular way that was related to recognition. Thornwall was not large by any measure that a city would apply to itself, but it was solid with the solidity of things that had been doing important work in one place for a very long time. The archive building was visible from the valley road. Grey limestone, several centuries of uncoordinated additions, creating a structure that looked less like a single building than like several buildings that had gradually merged out of proximity and shared purpose. The oath stone was in the civic square at the building's base. He dismounted at the square's horse ring, tied the grey, and stood looking at the stone for a moment. Not long, not sentimental. The kind of moment a man takes when he is about to do something he has done before and wants to be certain he is doing it for the right reasons. The oath stone was a flat-topped stone of no particular beauty, worn smooth by generations of rangers' hands and knees. No inscription, no carving. The compact's founding document was the inscription. The oaths were the symbol. The stone was simply where those things had been said often enough that the saying had become part of the stone's nature. He put his hand on it. Once, briefly. Then he went to find the scholar and submit his report. He used the waiting day well. The report ran to 12 pages in his field shorthand, expanded to 22 in the long form that the archive required. He covered the Goblin territorial marker he had first documented 3 years ago, now confirmed as belonging to a reorganized warband rather than scattered remnants. The escalation in sighting frequency along the Shadow Vale margin, the specific evidence of northward range expansion, the 3 annotated maps showing territorial marker progression at 6-month intervals, and the new Ridgebacks encounter, with marking analysis confirming warband continuity and the language of non-voluntary pressure applied with deliberate precision. He submitted it to the duty scholar before entering the chamber. The scholar acknowledged receipt with a stamp and a date. The record now reflected that he had tried. Whatever the council did with it, that stamp existed. The council session lasted 40 minutes. Aldous Cray presided. He heard the summary with the careful attention of a man who understood that what he did with his face during a ranger's testimony was itself a form of institutional communication. He did not speak while Gareth spoke. He did not speak for a long moment after. Braver Ostmark spoke first. She was the conservationist senior, and she held her seat with the competence of someone who had been holding it for 11 years and had learned that the surest way to keep a seat was to be absolutely consistent. She was absolutely consistent. The Compact's territorial mandate covered the management of non-human threats to borderland communities within commissioned rangers' territories. The Goblin escalation was a legitimate commission matter. The archive held it. The commission responded as circumstances required. This was the founding structure. Individual field rangers were individually commissioned. The warband's range now crosses 3 commission boundaries, Gareth said. Individual field rangers are individually commissioned to address threats within their territories, Ostmark said. Coordination requires a threshold certification. I am requesting consideration of that certification. Durran Vale spoke then. He was the expansionist seat, and his careful neutrality in this moment told Gareth something about which direction the morning's private conversations had run. The final threshold required documented evidence of a sanctioned threat that could not be resolved by other means. The warband, as documented, represented a territorial management issue. It did not yet represent a threshold event. Yet, Gareth noted the word, filed it. He looked at Aldous Cray. Cray was looking at the annotated map, the one showing the 3-year progression of the territorial markers, the one in which the northward pressure was not a matter of interpretation but of documented fact. He had the expression of a man reading something he had hoped not to have confirmed. He did not vote. He abstained. The session concluded. The report was filed under territorial management, ongoing. The scholar's stamp remained. The record reflected what had happened in this room. Gareth collected the grey from the horse ring. He stood in the civic square for a moment, hand on the oath stone. The stone was the same stone. He mounted and rode south. The road back through the ridgebacks was empty of goblins. The northeast sky, as he rode, had the particular quality of late autumn overcast, dense, low, the colour of pewter that has been handled for a long time. He thought about the word yet and about the direction it pointed. He thought about Aldrich's boy and the clean tracks on the north path, and the goblin markings copied into a private notation system that had arrived at the same conclusions as 30 years of compact training. He thought about Caden. Blind or bought? Halrich's assessment 2 years ago of the lord whose steward was running an annexation on his behalf. The steward believes bought but cannot prove it. The word believes was the operative word. Halrich had excellent judgment about people and excellent sources in the courier network, and believes from Halrich meant has substantial supporting evidence, but lacks the final confirmation. A lord who was bought was a closed door. A lord who was blind was a door that a man with sufficient evidence and the right kind of access might still open. The compact had declined to be the vehicle. That did not mean there was no vehicle. He rode south, and he thought. And by the time Millbrook's smoke appeared on the afternoon horizon, he had arrived at a plan that was not yet a plan, but had the shape of one. The rough form of something that would need time and evidence, and the particular patience of a man who understood that the most important actions were frequently the ones that looked, from the outside, like nothing was happening. He had perhaps 18 months, maybe 2 years. He would use them carefully. Kren came back in late autumn. The village had known this was coming, not from any announcement, but from the particular quality of the waiting that had settled over Millbrook since the survey completed. The way a body knows before the mind does that something is not finished. He came on a grey morning with 2 guards who had the aspect of professional soldiers rather than garrison muscle. Upright men who stood on the road's verge with the patient, contained violence of people who had learned that standing still was often more effective than moving. He had a document case under one arm and the expression of a man engaged in routine administrative work. Which he was. That was the particular quality of what he did. It was administrative work, and it was also the systematic conversion of one arrangement of the world into another arrangement, accomplished through language and stamps and the institutional weight of legitimate authority. Kren was not threatening. Kren was a process. The first levy was not large. That was the point. A large first levy produced resistance. A small first levy produced compliance, and compliance produced a precedent, and precedent was the most durable thing Kren built. Gareth watched from the tree line. He had been back from Thornwall 3 weeks. He had the particular stillness of a man who had decided what the current moment required, and had found that the current moment required, above almost all things, that he not act. He wrote it down. The patience changed. This was what Yarina noticed first, before the formal documentation, before the levy amounts began to add up in ways that the villagers' accounts could not comfortably absorb. The patients changed. Not their ailments. Their ailments were what ailments had always been in a borderland village in autumn. The first respiratory infections, the injuries from harvest work, the chronic conditions that the season's dampness exacerbated. The ailments were the same. The people carrying them were different. The difference was in the eyes. Farmers who had come into the shop in previous years with the focused worry of people managing difficulties, they understood now came in with a different quality of concern. Not focused, not productive, the worry of people managing something whose edges they could not locate. The levy was comprehensible. What the levy represented was not. Quite. Lysa noticed it too and said nothing, which was how Lysa handled most things she couldn't fix with medicine. She tended the sick and charged fairly, and moved through the shop with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided that keeping things functioning was the best available contribution to a situation that was going to get worse before it got better. Yarena watched her mother and learned from this also. Diane was on the north path at dawn. He had been on the north path at dawn with increasing regularity and decreasing announcement since the first week of Gareth's return from Thornwall. Gareth had never told him to patrol. He had not needed to. The understanding had arrived the same way most of Dane's practical education arrived. Not through instruction, but through the accumulated weight of example and the boy's own extension of principles he had already absorbed. Gareth watched the Greys' tracks when Dane returned and read the patrol route from them. The field margin, the wood's edge, the approach to the lightning-scarred oak, and the withdrawal to the second tree-line ridge before the return. Sound. Not elegant, not yet. There was a section near the elder stand where the route exposed him unnecessarily to anyone watching from the northeast margin, but sound in its fundamentals. He noted the section near the elder stand in the private ledger. He did not mention it. The boy would find it himself. He usually did. The goblin sightings increased through winter into the following spring with the consistency of something that was not seasonal variation but pressure, sustained, directional, originating from the same northeast quadrant that the territorial markers had been pointing toward for 3 years. 3 reports in the first month after the levy, 5 in the second. Not attacks. The creatures appeared and withdrew, tracing the village's perimeter in the particular pattern of a population mapping an obstacle rather than engaging it. Vera's garrison guards received the reports and filed them in the manner of people performing the administrative gesture of receiving information they had no intention of acting on. The wood is the compact's concern, one of them told Aldrich Valemark, when Aldrich walked to the garrison post specifically to make the report in person. We manage the settled territory. The goblins are in the settled territory, Aldrich said, with the particular patience of a man who had made this argument before and found it necessary to make it again. When they represent a formal threat to persons or property, the guard said, we respond. Aldrich looked at the guard for a moment with the expression of a tanner who had been listening to the quality of arguments for 40 years and had developed precise standards. Then he turned and walked back to the tannery. That evening, Gareth appeared at the workshop door of his own accord for the first time in 6 months. Den, he said. Yes, Dan said from the fletching bench. The elder stand. On the return leg. You're exposed for 40 yards. Diane was quiet for a moment. I know. I noticed last week. Fix it. Yes. The second harvest under the levy was harder than the first. Not dramatically harder. The mechanism was the same. Kren, the document case, the professional guards, the administrative precision. What was harder was the mathematics. The first levy had taken what the village could absorb while still maintaining its fundamental functions. The second levy took what remained after the first had been taken, which was a different set of numbers from a different starting position, and the difference expressed itself in the quality of the subsequent winter. The mill reduced its hours. 3 families in the eastern quarter made arrangements that involved moving in with relatives rather than maintaining separate households. Old Marta's general store ran shorter on certain goods through January and February than it had in anyone's memory. And Marta, who had been managing the village's informal supply and demand intelligence for 20 years, said nothing about this in public and said rather a lot about it in private to the head woman Darsa, who listened and wrote things down and added the figures to the document she had been building since the first time Kren's name appeared in the official correspondence. Gareth added Darsa's figures to his own. The notebook was nearly full. He started a second one. He had been watching it for 40 minutes. This was longer than strictly necessary for threat assessment. He had the information he needed inside the first 10 minutes, the full picture inside 20. The extra 20 minutes was something else. A decision being made below the level of conscious deliberation, working through itself at its own pace, while he lay in the field margin with the autumn grass against his cheek, and the grey in the trees behind him, and the evening light going flat and directionless the way it did in the hour before dark. The goblin was alone. This was unusual enough to warrant the extra attention. The sighting pattern for the past 8 months had been pairs at minimum, groups of 3 most commonly. A lone scout operating the field edge at dusk either meant the warband had sent a specific individual for a specific purpose, or it meant something had happened to the rest of the patrol, and this one had been separated. It was not lost. Its movement was too deliberate for lost. The systematic back and forth along the field margin, the pauses at intervals that corresponded to the sight lines from the village, the way it stopped at the high points and turned to look. It was mapping. It was counting. From its current position, it could see the Thistle and Tankard, the general store, the near corner of Blackwood's tannery, and the road south. It was counting guards. It was counting buildings. It was doing, at the field margin in the failing light, precisely what Kren had done at the wood's edge 3 years ago, with different tools and a different employer and the same fundamental purpose. Dian had been a ranger long enough to understand the significance of this. He had not been a ranger long enough to have done this before. He took it at 30 yards on the exhale, in the moment between one deliberate pause and the next, with an arrow from the bow that had been Gareth's and was becoming his by daily use. The shot was clean in the technical sense. The angle, the release, the flight. Clean in every dimension that could be assessed before the fact, and in the only dimension that could be assessed after it, which was that it was over quickly. He did not move for a full minute after. The evening continued. The birds that had startled at the release settled back into their routines with the pragmatic indifference of creatures for whom most loud sounds resolved into non-threats. The field was still. The village behind him was doing the things villages did at this hour. Fires being lit, animals being settled, the sounds of ordinary life conducting its ordinary business in complete ignorance of what had just happened in the far field margin. He got up and walked to it. He stood over it for a moment with the particular quality of stillness that comes after rather than before. Not uncertainty about what had been done, but the first encounter with the reality that it had been done and that reality was now permanent. He was 16 years old. He had been preparing for this moment in one sense or another for 4 years. He had not been prepared for the specific weight of the afterwards. He searched it. The markings. Same warband, same modifications he had been cataloguing for 18 months. Same north by northwest origin. He copied them into his notation system with the precision of a man recording evidence, which was what he was. Then he buried it. Not quickly. Properly with the camp shovel he had taken to carrying on the evening patrols 6 months ago, when the sighting frequency had passed the threshold that made carrying it a reasonable precaution. The ground was hard with early frost. It took 20 minutes. He was back in the cottage before full dark. He sat at the fletching bench and sharpened an arrowhead that did not need sharpening, and thought about nothing in particular for an hour. In the way that the mind processes things, it is not quite ready to examine directly. Then he went to bed. At breakfast, he put the notation on the table between them. Gareth looked at it for a long time. He looked at the marking analysis. He looked at the compass bearing notation. He looked at the behavior assessment, mapping, not raiding, systematic field margin survey, guard count probable. In Dane's shorthand that had arrived at the same conclusions as 30 years of compact training by a route that had nothing to do with compact training. He set it down. "You buried it," he said. "Yes." Gareth drank from his cup. The mead in the morning jug was the one concession he made to the hour. A small pour, more ritual than quantity. The habit of a man for whom certain consistencies were themselves a kind of practice. "Good," he said. He passed the notation back across the table. Dan folded it and put it with the others in the oilskin roll. That was all. It was enough. It was, in fact, precisely sufficient. Not more than what was needed and not less, which was the register Gareth operated in, and which Diane had been learning to recognize for 3 years as a form of respect rather than a form of economy. She came on a Wednesday. This detail lodged in Gareth's mind the way certain details lodged. Not because Wednesday had any significance, but because the choice of it said something. She had not come on a market day when Millbrook's road would have been full of traffic, and her arrival would have been one thing among many. She had not come on a Sunday when the village's rhythms were domestic and her presence would have felt intrusive. She came on a Wednesday, which was the most ordinary day the borderland calendar possessed, the day when nothing in particular was scheduled to happen, which meant her arrival was the only thing happening, which meant everyone would see it. 3 attendants, no soldiers. A formal notice of survey carried in a leather document case by the youngest attendant, a boy of perhaps 17 with the precise, unhurried movement of someone trained in administrative procedure. 2 others flanked her. Not guards, the posture was wrong for guards. More like an entourage, people whose presence communicated that she was a person of sufficient consequence to have people around her without communicating threat. She rode a grey horse. Not the grey. A different animal, better bred, with the collected gait of a horse that had been trained to make its rider look composed. The horse did not need to work at this. Gareth was at the workshop door when the sound of hooves reached him. He had the habit, 30 years established, of noting everything that entered his peripheral awareness without looking directly at it. And what he heard told him enough to put down the fletching jig and stand with his arms at his sides before she had come around the corner of the lane. Lady Vera Caden Ashford was perhaps his age. Younger by 3 years, he thought. He had not seen her since the district assemblies at Thornwall, and time changed its accounting on people differently. She wore travelling clothes of a quality that communicated wealth without advertising it. Her hair was dark and dressed practically, as someone who had learned early that elaborate presentation was its own kind of vulnerability. She sat the grey horse with the easy authority of someone who had been riding since before she had words for it. She was moving through the village the way a senior administrator moved through a settlement she was assessing. Not inspecting exactly, but attending. Her gaze moved from the mill to the market square to old Marta's storefront, to the tannery and the workshop beside it, with the even, unhurried interest of someone for whom all of this information was useful. She passed through Gareth's section of road. Her gaze reached the workshop door, the man standing in it. Her gaze moved on, not a flicker, not a hesitation. The particular quality of a gaze moving from one point of interest to the next, finding the workshop door unremarkable and continuing. It was the most precisely calibrated non-acknowledgement Gareth had ever received, and he had received several in 30 years of court-adjacent work. And he understood, in the 4 seconds it took her horse to complete its passage of his section of road, exactly what it meant. She knew he was here. She had known before she rode into the village. She had known when she planned the visit, when she chose the Wednesday, when she selected the 3 attendants and left the soldiers behind. She had done the accounting of what he represented and arrived at a figure, and the figure was not yet a problem worth addressing directly. The question, the one that settled into him like a nail finding wood, was whether she was right. He watched the rest of it from the workshop doorway with the particular quality of stillness that 30 years of ranging had made second nature. She dismounted at the market square. She spoke to Darsa with the warm attention of a superior who genuinely respected competence in others. Which she did, he thought. She was not performing this. She had simply learned early that competence was a resource worth cultivating rather than an irritant worth suppressing. She asked thoughtful questions about the mill's output and the timber operation and the winter road conditions. She complimented old Marta's storefront in the specific way that told Marta she had actually looked at it. She spent 20 minutes in the market square and left without having done anything that could be called threatening. The boy with the document case stamped 3 forms at Darsa's council table and left copies for the record. Survey confirmation, administrative reclassification notice, and a letter from Lord Caden's office expressing his lordship's warm interest in the continued well-being of the Millbrook community under the new administrative arrangement. The letter was beautifully written. It was, Gareth thought, the most dangerous document currently in the village archive. She rode out the east road at a walk. The grey horse's collected gait did not vary. She did not look back. Gareth went inside and sat at the fletching bench and looked at the half-finished arrow he had set down 40 minutes ago, and thought. She had come to see what she had. She had seen it. She had assessed the ranger at the workshop door and found him categorized. Aware of her operation, not yet in possession of sufficient evidence to move against it, not positioned with any institutional support that would make acting on insufficient evidence worthwhile. She had looked at him and done the arithmetic and found the answer manageable. He thought about whether she was right. He thought about Caden, about what it would take to get to Caden, about the route south and the time it would require, and the institutional weight of a formal interview request versus the administrative weight of what she was building here. Document by document, form by form, stamp by stamp. He thought about the boy at the fletching bench 2 weeks ago, putting the notation on the table between them. The burial. The specific competence of a person who had been learning something for 4 years and had arrived at its deeper principles independently. He thought, I have perhaps 6 months before she decides I've moved from categorized to problem. He picked up the arrow and the fletching jig. He began calculating.